Welcome to Token Show, the variety show about things that matter. I'm Lacey Kemp. Our episode today, Bluegrass and Social Consciousness, taped at the Sound Emporium in Nashville, Tennessee.
Folks back home, where I left my mother and daddy all alone. There's been a lot of changes there since I've been around. I'd like to wander back to the old hometown. You never miss the home folks until you've gone away. Then you'll need a friend to help you every day. Then you call on mother, but she won't be around. I'd like to wander back to the old hometown. Since I've been around, I've never found a place like the old hometown. If I could live life over, I'd never roam around. I'd like to wander back to the old hometown. You never miss the home folks until you've gone away. And then you need a friend to help you every day. And then you call on mother, but she won't be around. I'd like to wander back to the old hometown.
Great stuff, folks. Fantastic. Stephen Mojan there, my old hometown. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
We were counting before the show started here. We have a bunch of bluegrass royalty here in the room, and we counted up how many years of bluegrass study and performance is represented in the circle here today. 176 years at least plus represented. And so it's quite impressive, and we're delighted to have you all with us here today. Perhaps a not necessarily intuitive theme, bluegrass and social consciousness, which is so often seen as a sort of traditional music form. And yet Bryan Sutton over here, who's been with Tokens quite a few times, Bryan and I have been talking over the last month or so about this notion of bluegrass and sometimes even dipping into a little social dissent, but perhaps a larger theme of social consciousness. And Bryan, I think you taught me something that I don't know that I had ever thought about as we were talking about this. I can be a pretty sentimental guy myself, but I've always kind of looked upon that as a sort of manly weakness, you know. But you pointed to the way in which nostalgia need not be necessarily mere sentimentality. But I think you said something like, perhaps nostalgia might be seen as a form of lamentation regarding the status quo, which I thought was terribly insightful. So how do you see that in bluegrass?
Well, I think it starts, as far as what we assumed to be about the roots of bluegrass, it was always a very social thing. The roots of the roots musically were, these Scots-Irish ballads and ballad singing, real community-oriented. And that carried into at least how bluegrass was sort of created here in the States, talking through mid-1930s through mid-1940s. But it was always about community. And I think the social consciousness within bluegrass is just recognizing how powerful community is in the first place. And so you have a lot of songs that are about nostalgia, like what we just did, where the lead character leaves home, but he misses it, and there's not even a friend to help him around, and he calls his mother and she's not around, and he's just, lamenting the old hometown. And it's not just about that one song. That's a pretty consistent theme among others in bluegrass, which again, like you say, don't really, from a social perspective, don't stand to raise their collective fists in the air and talk about how bad life is. But because of something, bluesy or lonesome, we have a song about it to help you through it. More of this empathy through these various themes like nostalgia or, the blues or the sort of plight of the coal miner or worker or anything like that. So again, I think it's birthed in the idea of just bluegrass as a social music. I mean, we're sitting in a circle playing the way people played 100 years ago. You're just sharing this music. It's all acoustic instruments, what makes it very portable,
And grounded, too, in the genre of the blues, I suppose, or at least relationship to the blues. How do you think about, I think you might have even used the phrase, it's almost like an Appalachian white man blues.
It could be considered that, as far as, again, our sort of American conversation about what blues is as an African-American-based kind of form of expression, which is totally true. I think it's important to recognize, at least in the bluegrass strain of things, again, back to the roots of these Scots-Irish ballads and fiddle tunes, as it carries over to the life that a lot of people in southern Appalachia experienced, again, late 1800s through early 1900s, a hard life, to sort of not try to compare the black experience. There was no physical shackles, but you were oppressed if you were a coal miner, and your grandfather was likely just as oppressed. And it's not so much about, the blues turning into, we're going to turn this and weaponize this. Mm-hmm. It's really, again, more about the community and even though this is a heartbreaking kind of scene, we're going to come together again as community. The value of community kind of helps you through that.
Blues is, without a doubt, a major element in bluegrass music.
That's Greg Reish, director of the Center for Popular Music and professor of music history at Middle Tennessee State University, who also joined us at the Sound Emporium. Greg is one of the world's leading scholars on the history of American music, specifically in the areas of folk and, of course, bluegrass. Here he makes the point that bluegrass, which is popularly thought of as a hillbilly white man's genre, actually finds its roots in the African-American genre of the blues.
This manifests in all sorts of ways. There are actual blues songs or original bluegrass songs that use blues structures. There are elements in the vocal and instrumental improvisational styles that relate or extend directly from blues. Bill Monroe, the father of bluegrass, as he's known, deservedly so, in my opinion, he said on, I think, more than one occasion that what he really wanted to be in life was a blues singer.
Really?
And he was very influenced by an African-American man who lived in his community in western Kentucky named Arnold Schultz. We don't have any recordings of Schultz, so all that we know about him comes through the accounts of people like Bill Monroe and some of the western Kentucky thumb pickers of the kind of Merle Travis tradition. A lot of them point to Schultz as an exemplary blues musician, not limited to blues. He did a lot of different things. He accompanied fiddle music, but a real guitar virtuoso, and probably the main direct source of African-American musical traditions and music making that people like Bill Monroe in western Kentucky were able to hear. So blues is a really, really strong element. It's in the songwriting, it's in the vocal styles, the instrumental styles. And then, of course, there's the banjo itself, the presence of the banjo as one of the central defining instruments of the genre of bluegrass. Well, the banjo is an African-American instrument whose roots go back to West Africa. So the very fact that the banjo is, thanks to Earl Scruggs, at the center of the genre and its identity as an idiom of music, that owes something huge to African-American music. And you could go on and, in the fiddling styles and, lots of other elements. It's so deep and broad that this influence of African-American culture on bluegrass has to be almost immeasurable.
asked Greg about the conversation Bryan Sutton and I had about nostalgia in bluegrass, that instead of mere sentimentality, perhaps nostalgia serves as a form of social consciousness which laments the failings of the status quo.
I think that's quite accurate. Nostalgia is a complicated phenomenon in the human experience. Nostalgia can be a simple escape mechanism, but I think it is, without question in my mind, a way of dealing with modernity in its ever-changing forms. It's a way of dealing with displacement. Part of the story of bluegrass, for example, is the migration of people off of farms and out of rural areas and into cities, into the industrial northern Midwest. And those feelings of displacement are dealt with through the music in nostalgic ways. And we see this in the songwriting of Lester Flatt, and we see this in countless bluegrass songs that refer to the old home place, that refer to the farm that, Daddy's farm, Grandpa's farm that I had to leave. I had to go to the city and work in the factory, and this is a new environment. So there are feelings of nostalgia that are wrapped up with the mythology of rural American life. I think the influence of African-American music and African-American culture on bluegrass, in fact, now it does come to the surface in explicit ways with certain song material. John Henry being a folk ballad about the steel driving man, that's something that's got a very long and rich history. Songs about labor or songs somehow related to work are baked into American folk traditions. Every American folk tradition, but it's a very prominent part of the African-American experience, obviously coming out of slavery and into the late 19th century, the days of sharecropping and building the railroads and convict labor, convict leasing, which was a widespread practice in the late 19th, early 20th century. All of these things were so much a part of the African-American experience, not unique, but so prominent in the African-American experience that they come out in that music in all sorts of ways. So you have work songs, which are generally defined as songs that are used in work. So they have a certain rhythmic element for the kinds of work that require group coordination, lining track when building the railroads, that kind of thing. But there are also songs about labor. And John Henry, as a ballad, a narrative folk song, a story song, but the story it tells is specifically about labor. And it's the classic man versus machine story with John Henry, the steel driving man who goes up against the new steam powered drill, which was, the newfangled invention back in the 1870s.
Well, when John Henry was a little baby boy.
Well, I could not help myself. I pushed my way into the bluegrass circle and asked if I could sing John Henry.
Well, John Henry's mammy looked down at him and said, Johnny gonna be a steel driving man, Lord, Lord. Johnny gonna be a steel driving man. Well, the man who invented that old steam drill, he thought it was mighty fine. John Henry drove it down 15 feet, while steam drill only made it 9. Lord, Lord, steam drill only made it 9. Well, John Henry's captain, he sat out on a rock, said, boys, this tunnel's caving in. John Henry smiled at his captain and said, boss, that's my hammer-sucking wind. Boss, that's my hammer-sucking wind. Now John Henry hammered in that old mountainside till his hammer, it caught on fire. The last 4 words was, and old John Henry said, give me a cool drink of water before I die. La, la, cool drink of water before I die.
In most versions, he wins the battle, but he dies in the process.
Yeah.
So he becomes this kind of larger-than-life, mythic, heroic, but also tragic figure. But the story itself speaks to one of the basic concerns of the human condition, the anxiety of technology.
Yeah.
Is that going to replace us? And for someone whose value, at least in the economic world, is defined primarily by their manual labor, well, a new machine that threatens that,
Right.
is kind of an existential threat.
Well, John Henry had a little woman. Now her name was Polly Ann. Johnny got sick, Lord, he had to go to bed. Polly drove that steel like a man, Lord, Lord. Polly drove that steel like a man. Well, they took John Henry to the graveyard, put him 6 feet under the sand. Every time that trains go rolling by, they say, yonder lies that steel driving man, Lord, Lord. Yonder lies that steel driving man. They say, yonder lies that steel driving man, Lord, Lord. Yonder lies that steel driving man.
These are age-old themes, and they come out in folk tradition in all sorts of ways.
It points back to your commentary earlier about the ways in which nostalgia is a sort of way of coping with being displaced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's one of the fundamental anxieties, I think,
Yeah.
of the human condition, and the music can help work through that in various ways.
You're listening to Tokens Public Theology, Human Flourishing and the Good Life. Most grateful to have you joining us. If you have not yet done so, we ask why not? And if you have not yet done so, then subscribe today to the Tokens Podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to send us a message, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at podcast@tokensshow.com. Remember, always you can sign up for our email list or find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokensshow.com. And just like today, we've got several friends of Tokens joining us here in the studio, watching this stellar gathering here in Studio A at the Sound Emporium. This is our episode on the social consciousness of bluegrass with Greg Reish and Bryan Sutton, along with some of Bryan's friends who between them have about as much bluegrass notoriety, fame, and decades in bluegrass as any group you could hope to put together here live from the Sound Emporium. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens. This is our episode on bluegrass and social consciousness, taped live at Nashville's Sound Emporium. Back here to Bryan Sutton, Grammy awardee and 10-time IBMA Guitarist of the Year. Bryan, another sort of key theme we've talked about is sort of notion of lament. Lament, of course, is always a communal exercise. But how do you see kind of lament working in bluegrass community or bluegrass tradition?
Well, again, just back to the sort of the concept of folk music as a way to bring people together and share an experience. It's not just you going through this. We're all going through this, and this song is a way that we can empathize. We can share in each other's heartbreak or loneliness or loss or whatever it is. That's a common theme in amongst bluegrass tunes, to the point of community, like you mentioned, folks coming from all over the country here. I mean, and around the world too. There are pockets of bluegrass. It's not an incredibly commercially vibrant form of music, but as a continued kind of thread of community and the way music brings people together, there's nothing like it, really. We were talking about that too, of just bluegrass festivals that you went to and people go to now. There's as many people that are there to just play with the folks that they met last year. Who cares who's on stage? Who they bought a ticket to see. They'd rather just sit at their campground and play music all weekend. And so it's that, whether it's a lament or a celebration or just a fiddle tune. Again, we oftentimes go straight to these vocal tunes, but just the power of sharing a fiddle tune in a circle like this, and there are thousands,
Yeah.
or at least. And it's a cool way to just look into how different people from around the world really learn these tunes. And I always remark when I'm doing lessons, teaching guitar players fiddle tunes, it's like we don't have an original manuscript of this tune. The composer's not alive saying you play it this way, but somehow you go on YouTube and you type in, Soldier's Joy or something like that, you'll see 1,000 versions of Soldier's Joy that are all different, but yet they all kind of have a common thread. And again, I think that's, whether it's the instrumental fiddle tunes or the vocal stylings of whoever, it's just songs that are about these people coming together and sharing in it. And I think where we're going right now is, more of the lament and more of the sadness, more of true loss, which Becky has brought a song today, which really, I think, helps make this, specifically poignant, just because it's about, an experience of hers.
And I don't think we've officially welcomed Becky Buller yet, but welcome, Becky, on Fiddle There today.
Thank you, Lee. It's good to be here.
Delighted to have you with us today. Tell us about the song you're going to do.
This is one I wrote with Sarah Majors from here in town, and it's loosely based on the loss of my mother-in-law. I never got to meet Miss Laura because Jeff and I got together a couple years after she had passed away. But I was just trying to put myself in my father-in-law Sterling's shoes and how it felt to be him at that house all by himself after she passed. And hopefully this will bring some comfort to somebody out there listening. We're not alone. You are not alone in your loneliness. This is called Heart of the House.
The curtains stay closed so the dust doesn't show. The linoleum needs fixing. Nothing's boiling on the stove. Used to be a happy home, but nobody's in the kitchen. It's the heart of the house, the heart of the house. It's the heart of the house, and it's empty. Ooh, he's a part of the house, and he's empty. It's empty. He's a part of the house, and he's empty. She was the heart of the house, and it's empty. He's
Thank you, Becky. That's beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful. So, Bryan, you mentioned how with the notion of the social consciousness of bluegrass, it doesn't often kind of shake its fist at the machine, but it does happen on occasion.
Right.
And so you've got, kind of going back to the John Henry, this sort of cry on behalf of labor, or this sort of observation about displacement in the modern world vis-a-vis the machine with John Henry, or the sorts of severe impact upon communities, severe impact upon the environment. And so this classic song, Black Waters, you're about to do for us. But how do you see that, this sort of strong element of critique that you do occasionally get coming out in bluegrass?
Yeah, I mean, to some of the other points we've made about, nostalgia or lamenting or empathy, this, again, fist in the air kind of song doesn't happen a lot in bluegrass, and it's hard to really find one that we would all do in a jam session any night of the week or any festival. But I definitely would say bluegrass has been used by people as a style, again, as a folk music, as a way people come together with these instruments to support songs. Again, now you're talking Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan.
Seeger and Dylan are, of course, among the greatest in the so-called New Folk Revival, which shares common roots with a great deal of bluegrass.
Bluegrass started to merge in some ways with the folk revival starting in the late 1950s.
That's Greg Reish again, professor of music history and expert in American folk music traditions.
This too comes out of the coalescence of bluegrass with the folk revival, which itself was tied into various kinds of social protest movements, environmentalism, anti-war, and civil rights, a whole bunch of huge issues. But they were presenting it in a way that was more appealing to the typical folk revival audience of that time period. So college-educated, generally affluent, generally urban, generally white listeners, which was not up to that point the core market for bluegrass. But bluegrass as a branch of country music, as a particular style within the broad spectrum of country music, was starting to be threatened economically in the 1950s. The advent of rock and roll kind of upended the entire recording industry. Everybody was scrambling to figure out how to react to that. I mean, here in Nashville, that it led to the development of the Nashville sound, this kind of slick pop version of country music, with bluegrass being in some way such a retrogressive style, string band instrumentation and other elements, singing old songs in old vocal styles. Bluegrass really had to struggle to find or keep its audience. So the late 1950s started to be a difficult time for bluegrass music, just in strictly economic terms. And some artists like Jimmy Martin, the Osborne Brothers, they kind of veered a little bit more towards mainstream country, started adding drums and some pedal steel and working with Nashville songwriters like Felice and Boudleaux Bryant and so on. But there were other bluegrass artists, some of them new, some of them had been around for a while, but they were moving towards the folk scene and realized, Alan Lomax, the famous folklorist, wrote an article in the late 50s where he called bluegrass music folk music with overdrive. So a lot of folkies, through their interest in the banjo, Pete Seeger, they were finding their way to bluegrass, to Flatt and Scruggs, and then groups like the Country Gentlemen come along who are tailoring their sound and their repertory specifically to this young folk audience. So with the folk revival came the Bob Dylan songs and came this kind of new wave of social consciousness, especially as we move into the 1960s. Yeah. So artists, even some of the older established artists, were finding new material, finding new ways to present their material. They're playing on college campuses and doing the folk festival circuit and so on. It's very, very different from what they were doing 10, 15 years earlier. And then you have new artists who are writing new material, and also artists who, bluegrass artists who are doing versions of newly written songs from the folk tradition. A song like Gene Ritchie's Black Waters, for example, which is not a bluegrass song, strictly speaking, wasn't created as a bluegrass song. but it's a song from a bona fide East Kentucky folk artist who came from a distinguished ballad singing family.
Well, I come from the mountains, Kentucky's my home, where the wild deer and the black bear so lately did roam.
But in the 60s, Jean Ritchie herself got caught up in the social consciousness of the folk movement and started to write new songs like Blackwaters about mountaintop removal, which is something that she, observed right there in her own home county, Perry County, Kentucky.
Back here to Bryan Sutton.
The song here, Black Waters, was written by Jean Ritchie, who grew up in coal country in Kentucky, Perry County. And one of the things that always is just amazing to me about just sort of the oppressive life of coal miners is this whole idea of ration script, where they would get paid basically to go spend some form of approved currency in a store owned by the company. So they would basically work for money, work for currency, and then have to go basically give that money right back just to have food. And so they really weren't earning anything as far as having something to save or a life to build. I mean, it was really like this vicious cycle. And again, generations of that. So this song, it really encapsulates a lot of what it would have felt like to be one of these families. And again, speaking of community, where you get less of, again, fist in the air, speaking, how hard this is, but, dreaming of a better day at some point. And so this also, one of the reasons I like it, it speaks to the landscape as well, and what the coal companies have done over the years with mountaintop removal, or what this song again is actually about is I think it's called slurry, the sort of leftover residue from the coal process that they just basically would release back into the streams and rivers in these places where they were mining.
1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I come from the mountains, Kentucky's my home, where the wild deer and the black bear so lately did roam. By cool rushing waterfalls, the wildflowers dream, and through every green valley there runs a clear stream. Sad scenes of destruction on every hand, and there's only black waters run down through my land. Sad scenes of destruction on every hand. Black waters run down through the land. Oh, the quail, she's a pretty bird. She sings a sweet tongue. In the roots of tall timbers, she nests with her young. But the hillside explodes with the dynamite's roar, and the voices of the small birds will sound there no more. And the hillsides come a-sliding so awful and grand, and the flooding black waters rise over my land. Sad scenes of destruction on every hand. Black waters run down through the land. In the rising of the springtime, we planted our corn. In the ending of the springtime, we buried our son. In the summer come, a nice man says everything's fine. My employer just requires a way to his mine. Then they threw down the mountain and they covered my corn. And the grave on the hillside's a mile deeper down. And the man stands and talks with his hat in his hand as the poison black sad scenes of destruction on every hand. Black waters run down through the land. Well, I ain't got no money, not much of a home. I own my own land, but my land's not my own. If I had 10 million somewhere thereabout, I would buy Perry County and I'd run them all out. Sit down on the bank with my bait and my can, and just watch the clear waters run down through my land. Well, wouldn't that be like the old promised land? Black waters, no more in my land. Black waters, no more in my land.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, The Good Life. This is our episode on bluegrass and social consciousness. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Token Show and our episode on the social consciousness of bluegrass, taped at Nashville's Sound Emporium.
The interesting paradox for me about bluegrass is that it was, in some ways you could argue it still is, the most retrogressive and simultaneously the most progressive form of country music. So it had all of these kind of backward-looking elements in the songwriting, in the use of acoustic string instruments, in some of the vocal styles, which later came to be called the high, lonesome sound. But the speed, the tempos that they were playing at, the virtuosity on the instruments that was required to play at those tempos, the improvisation that is very much an essential part of bluegrass, the bluegrass breaks, as they're called, between vocal verses. These elements were very progressive for the time. And that, to me, is one of the things that's always made bluegrass so fascinating. How do these things coexist, and how do they operate in the minds and hearts of the listeners?
Yeah, I don't think that I've ever, prior to conversing with you here, I don't know that I've ever heard bluegrass alluded to as progressive, which is a fascinating sort of categorization. Is it progressive only at the level of the musical boundaries that it's breaking, or does it have certain other sorts of progressive elements to its social commentary?
I would say at first the progressive elements are primarily in the musical features themselves, and the way the instruments are played, in the rhythms which have been included in the mix that led to the birth of rock and roll in the 1950s. It's no mere coincidence that Elvis Presley's first single for Sun Records in 1954, on one side was his version of an African-American rhythm and blues song, and on the other side was his version of Bill Monroe's Blue Moon of Kentucky, both of them done in Elvis's own very distinctive rock and roll way. So I think in the early years, the progressivism was primarily of a musical sort. But by the late 50s and definitely into the 1960s, when bluegrass started to get wrapped up with the folk revival, then more of a socially conscious political progressivism started to enter into bluegrass. Later you get John Prine singing, writing and singing Paradise, which became a bluegrass standard. Of course, Hazel Dickens, who's singing songs about the plight of the miners in various contexts, about labor organization, but also singing about women's rights. I mean, her album came out a little bit later, I think 1980, if I remember, hard-hitting songs for hard-hit people. I mean, and this is a bluegrass album, by someone, written and performed by someone who's now considered, among the canon of great bluegrass artist, Hazel Dickens. So there's new repertory being introduced, some written by bluegrass artists themselves, but also coming from the folk world. And some of those songs are what you might call socially conscious, which was all part of the movement of the time.
Hard-hitting songs for hard-hit people. percolates in me as a sort of compassion for one's fellows out of one's own difficult experience, as a sort of fertile ground for paying attention to other people. So think like Ola Belle Reed's song, I've Endured.
I've endured, I've endured. How long has one endured?
I would point out that that was nothing new in folk music of the time and bluegrass of the time. It's actually a tradition that has a long and rich history. You can go back to pre-bluegrass days of the 1920s, 1930s, where you have folk singers, Aunt Molly Jackson and Woody Guthrie and a number of others, Harry McClintock, Haywire Mac. These are singers and songwriters out of these earlier pre-bluegrass folk traditions who are members of these affected communities, whether it be Appalachian mining communities or, displaced Oklahoma refugee communities in the case of Woody Guthrie. And some of what they were writing and singing was meant to be a voice for these people who were in many ways voiceless at the time. Woody Guthrie put out an album in the 1940s called Dust Bowl Ballads, which is very explicitly about the plight of the Dust Bowl refugees. But he's not so much singing to them, he's singing for them and presenting that to the people in power on the East Coast and the West Coast, and affluent people and politically powerful people who need to hear what is happening to his people. So that sense of a folk singer being a representative of sort, a mouthpiece of sort for a community in the face of whatever its struggles may be, that's something that's got a very long and rich history.
Some years ago, my wife unexpectedly caught me at home at lunchtime. I'd snuck away from work and she found me with an unexpected partner in the living room. I'd saved up some money during a season when our finances were tight, young mouths to feed on a college professor salary. I'd gone downtown and blown my savings all in one fell swoop at Williams Fine Violins here in Nashville on a beautiful, curvy, 6.5-foot tall upright bass. And there I was in our living room when my wife caught me in a tryst with my new acoustic bass. Well, one of the things about a bass is that it's not meant to be played alone. So I started inviting folks to the house to teach me. In time, I worked up my courage to go to a bluegrass festival. And it was like a whole new world just opened up. Drove up to Kentucky with one of my boys and spent the weekend. There were hundreds of people out in the country in these fields. No telling how many fiddles, banjos, guitars, mandolins, and yes, upright basses. Folks sitting around in circles playing with each other, teaching each other, talking, laughing. The music made the community. There was a stage, for sure, with booked acts. But the people who played on stage would often go out and play in these ad hoc circles of normal folks playing and talking, sitting under a tree or around a picnic table, sometimes playing way past midnight. No us and them, just community. It was amazing. It was like a sort of stake in the ground against the privatizing individualism of late modern consumerist culture. And it seemed that every one of the bluegrass greats in the circle that day in the Sound Emporium had their own such story that was their entree into their life calling.
One day my dad got a wild hair to learn to play guitar, and I was, 5 or 6, and wanted to do what Dad did. So that began our journey from, the mecca of bluegrass, which is Western Massachusetts, the hill towns of Western Massachusetts. But it's weird, as we started getting into music, just learning to play something, the first things we found were jam sessions that were playing primarily bluegrass and old country. And that's what I remember growing up. I mean, that's every weekend in the winter. Yeah. And then every weekend in the summer, we were out at some bluegrass festival camping. And I remember the community aspect so much. So many of these festivals, people would sort of magnetize
to festivals from all over in the region. But we'd camp together, we'd eat together. There'd be one person that would bring a pig roast, and then one person would bring a giant skillet and make breakfast every morning. And it was this whole random people dropping by the campsites to hang out and jam and pick and just be together in a really positive way. And it was such a great way to grow up as a child because it was a safe environment back then. It was amazing. You know, the kids were all being looked out for by everybody. Yeah. And so we'd go run and play and then go have our own jam session somewhere. And it was a very great thing.
Yeah. Well, it's been a delight to have you all here in the circle today, here at the Sound Emporium. Becky Buller over there on that fiddle, Missy Raines on that bass, Stephen Mogen on the mandolin, Wes Corbett on that banjo, and Bryan Sutton curating this session for us. Bryan, always great to have you with us. Good to have you back again.
Yeah, good to be here.
And it's really been a delight, informative, educational, and moving.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot to bluegrass music, more than meets the ear for a lot of people.
Yes, indeed. So how are you going to take us out here?
Well, again, as we've been talking today about social consciousness, awareness, the bluegrass scene as a community, you know, from early days of roots and, you know, try to examine everything that kind of informs what bluegrass is and kind of what it's meant for people. It's always good to recognize, and this happens a lot, you know, in bluegrass shows too, where you kind of put a set of music together that kind of covers a lot of ground. Gospel tunes from more traditional bluegrass, you know, songs like Becky's that deal with heartbreak and loss and lonesome. And it's always good to kind of leave with a more collective, hopeful, empathetic kind of message. And so we've got an Old Bill Reed song that talks about hope, and Missy's going to sing it.
You know, I recorded a version of this tune, and one of the reasons that I was drawn to this song in the first place, and have been for years, is because it does speak to hope in such a beautiful way. But more than anything, it speaks about tenacity, and that really resonates with me. I think it resonates with a lot of people who've just been, you know, living life for a while and just coming back at it, and that's what this song really says to me.
Born in the mountains many long years ago, I've trod the hills and valleys through the rain and snow. I've seen the lightning flash and heard the thunder roll. I've endured. How long has one endured? Summertime on in the fall, too many mouths to feed that couldn't clothe us all. Sent to church on Sunday to learn the golden rule. I've endured. How long has one endured? I've seen many heartaches, there'll be many more. Lived, loved, and sorrowed, but to success's door. I've endured. How long has one endured?
You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, Good Life. Remember, you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcast. If you got feedback, send us email at podcast@tokensshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management, co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios, associate producers Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, music director Tim Lauer, engineering by Carrie Harmon, and special thanks to our live engineer of the Sound Emporium, Joe Trentacosti. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media LLC and
Great Feeling Studios.